Hello, my name is Scott Manley Hadley. This is Triumph of the Now TV, TOTN TV. This week's episode features Winnie M Li, a writer and activist whose debut novel, Dark Chapter, has just been published by Legend Press. It's about sexual assault based on an experience that happened to the author, so please do be aware there are some quite serious topics raised in this issue. We're going to open with a reading from the very start of the novel, and then which will be followed by an interview with Winnie, and then we'll end the episode with a second reading.
So this is the prologue from a novel, Dark Chapter, and this is the section that I wrote actually a few weeks after my own assaults. And it's the only one of two passages in the whole book which is written in first person, actually. They say events like this change your life forever, that your life will never be the same as it was the day before it happened, or even 2 hours before it happened, when I stood waiting for that bus out of Belfast, along the Falls Road to the west of the city. Is it melodramatic to think of life like that? Of a clean split struck straight down the breadth of your existence, severing your first 29 years from all the years that come after? I look across that gap now, an unexpected rift in the contour of my life, and I long to shout across that ravine to the younger me, who stands on the opposite edge, oblivious to what lies ahead. She is a distant speck. She seems lost from my perspective, but in her mind, she thinks she knows where she's going. There is a hiking guidebook in her hand, and the path that she is following. It will lead here, up this slope, and then along the edge of a plateau to gain the higher ground, merging with the hills above the city. She does not know who follows her. She's only thinking of the path ahead. But some things she cannot anticipate. I stand now on this side of the ravine, desperate to warn my earlier self of the person trailing her, skulking from bush to tree in her wake. Stop, I want to shout. It's not worth it. Just give up the trail and go home. But she wouldn't listen anyway. She's too stubborn, too determined to hike this trail on a day this crisp and clear. And now it's too late. She is in isolated country, and even if she were to turn back, she would inevitably encounter him, because he is behind her, watching her. By now she's traversed the slope and found the trail that runs between a sunlit pasture and the steep incline of the glen. She pauses for a moment, breathing in the beauty of this green track, the tree branches arching over the path, the bright field that stretches to her left. She has escaped the city. This is where the countryside really begins. It seems like a little bit of heaven for one last peaceful moment. But she's perched on the edge, and to her right, the ground plunges sharply into the ravine. The river below is a distant roar. The air up here smells of manure and sun and warm grass, and lazy insects drift in the filtered light beneath the trees. And then, glancing down the wooded chasm to her right, she sees a figure coming up the slope, trying to hide in the brush of the forest. Something skips unnaturally in the beat of her heart. Only then does she realize she is being followed. Now, years later, it is as if I am the one following my earlier self, haunting her every step, like some guardian angel arrived too late. She parts the branches in front of her, and I do it too, invisibly. She quickens her pace to lengthen the distance between them, and I fall in step. She instinctively knows she must reach the open ground before he catches her, so she tries to cover the last few yards of the path as it clears a ridge. With an invisible hand, I want to hold back the little bastard, lock him into position like a rugby player, while shouting to her to keep on going, to reach the meadow and then abandon the trail. Forget about the hike, just head straight to the busy road and go home. But I am powerless to stop it. Events must unfold as they already have. The past is our past, so I am stranded here on this side of the ravine, watching as he catches up to her. I don't want to see the rest of it. I've replayed it enough times already. If I could just freeze it there, in that final moment, perched between the sunlit pasture and the plunging abyss, then everything would still be fine. Only then, it would not be my life. It would be someone else's pleasant stroll through the Irish countryside on a spring afternoon. But my journey turned out to be a little different. My name is Winnie M Li. Just call me Winnie. And my book is called Dark Chapter. So it's being just kind of marketed as a crime novel. I would call it literary suspense. And if I had to describe it, I'd say it's about a crime which you see equally from the point of view of the victim and the perpetrator. So you kind of see their lives from childhood leading up to that crime. You see the crime from both perspectives, the kind of aftermath, the legal fallout, and then it kind of looks into the future in terms of how their lives are both affected by that one event. So the crime is a rape, and it was actually inspired by my own rape, which took place, in my own real life in 2008 when I was in Belfast.
Why did you decide to write a book about that?
Because it was like a huge event in my life. I mean, if for anybody that reads the book, you kind of understand how much a single act of violence like that can totally change the course of somebody's life. So I guess, I've always been a writer, and so since the age of 6, if you asked me, I would have said I wanted to write a book. So I guess as somebody who's always a writer, like, writing is how I deal with life and how I kind of try to make sense of life. So in the wake of something that massive, it takes years to recover from something like that, but inevitably I was going to have to write about it. And I guess it was such a massive event in my own life that it did prompt a lot of thinking, not just about this issue, but then also just about like how different lives can be based on the circumstances that you're born into. So it prompted a lot of thinking, and I kind of felt the only way I could really sort of do justice to the issue would be writing kind of a large, full-length novel, told from both perspectives. That's the book, by the way.
Why a novel?
Why a novel as opposed to
a memoir, an autobiography?
Yeah, I had actually, so I would say, as a writer, life writing or memoir is kind of my normal go-to form of writing. So I've been doing that like my whole life, effectively. So after the assault, I did treat the experience like through memoir, kind of short form stuff. But then I also read a lot of memoirs by rape survivors. I guess you can say there's like a subgenre of rape memoirs out there. Probably Lucky by Alice Sebold is the most famous one. And those are really good books, and they're incredibly well written, some of them. And I read a number of them right after my own rape, and they were incredibly helpful for me, actually, in terms of just the recovery process on some level and just connecting with other people that had been through that experience, I guess through the act of reading. So I kind of felt like it had already been done, though, by other people, by other writers, and I suppose I wanted to do something a little bit different, and I wanted to use fiction so I could explore the perspective of the rapist, of the perpetrator, which I don't think I'd seen done before in literature. And I kind of felt it was necessary, actually, to sort of try to confront that side of humanity which causes these kinds of crimes. And having been on the receiving end of that kind of violence, my own kind of imagination was prompted to think about that person who had done that to me. So I felt I could only really do that through a novel by writing fiction.
Was writing about it something that came after you'd moved on from it, or was part of your recovery?
I'd say it came after, right? So I came up with the idea of writing the novel actually just weeks after the assault. So like I said, writing is how I deal with life, right? So I was quite heavily traumatized. I was very heavily traumatized after the assault, so I wasn't really quite me. But there was a moment where I sat down and I wrote what ended up being the prologue, actually. And I just kind of sat down and it sort of just came out in about like 30 or 40 minutes. And I remember writing it, and it just sort of came out of nowhere. I remember reading it and thinking like, no, that's actually pretty good, right? So I'm like, all right. So I'm like, I can still write, And there was something quite reassuring about that, because on some level, if I could still write, then I was somewhere still me, somehow, despite all that had happened. So, but I kind of was like, okay, that's pretty good. Like, I'm going to turn that into a book somewhere down the line. But I kind of knew right then I obviously, had other things to deal with, such as like recovering from the assault first. So so I kind of put it to the side, but I always thought like, okay, I'm going to turn that into a book somewhere down the line. And I did, and it was quite soon after, like in those weeks and months after the assault, that I thought about actually writing a fiction book where it was told from both perspectives. Because I think the more I learned about my perpetrator, and there isn't really much I know about him in real life, but he did have, and he does have a very different life from me, like comes from a very different like kind of family and part of society and everything, that difference between our lives really struck me, and the fact that we came from very different worlds, and there was this one kind of quite violent intersection in our lives, and my life certainly hasn't been the same since, and I think his hasn't either. So So I kind of knew I wanted to write that, but it took about 5 years of recovery before I felt like I was actually at a point to have the perspective to write the book. So I basically had to kind of rebuild my whole life, and it was only when I felt like, okay, I could have this other career if I wanted, or I feel like I'm back to being closer to the person I was before the assault. It was only at that point that I realized, like, okay, I have the perspective to write about this as fiction. Yeah.
And you think the message I took away from the book really was the importance of people speaking about sexual assaults.
Yeah.
Why do people find that difficult?
Because I think there's still so much stigma about it, and there's such a uncomfortability about the issue. So there's often this tendency to like, oh, okay, let's forget that didn't happen, or let's just kind of sweep things under the carpet, because I think people just don't know what to do about it. It's such a shocking thing, and that's one reason people don't use the word rape anymore as much, because they use sexual assault. It's not as shocking, but I think there's something about the shock value of rape. Whatever, you can say maybe like we're in a patriarchal society and rape equals it, whatever, but regardless, there's something about the shock value of rape that just genuinely freaks people out, right? So, and the weirdness about that is like it's shocking and it freaks people out, and yet it's like incredibly prevalent, right? So 1 in 5 women in England and Wales will be the victim of at least an attempted rape in their lifetime, right? And that's kind of a statistic, right? Which has been proven. So there's this thing that's incredibly prevalent, and yet people are shocked and freaked out every time they hear about it. And I kind of think a lot of the work that needs to be done is to kind of cross that gap and just realize, like, well, actually, if it's something that's prevalent, like, we should be able to talk about it more in a way that it doesn't normalize it, because obviously it's an awful thing to have happen and it shouldn't be happening in the first place, but in a way that doesn't make victims feel like they're freaks or feel like they did something wrong.
Why did you think it was important and worthwhile to include the perpetrator's perspective?
So I think that by making us consider this crime from the perpetrator's perspective, it's kind of pushing the boundaries to pushing the boundaries of our own empathy, right, as human beings. So again, part of the shock value of rape is that like people just don't even want to think about rapists, right? Or there's this tendency to think about rapists as these like creepy people that hang out in bushes and jump women, right? Which is actually not that different from what happened to me in real life, right? So on one hand, I could just think, okay, it was a 15-year-old boy who raped me, and that's one of the reasons that I was interested in writing the book, is because how do you have somebody that young committing a crime that violent, right? So I was always prompted to think, like, well, what happened in that boy's life that led him to being a violent rapist at the age of 15? So I think that the only way we can really start to understand that behavior and try to prevent that kind of behavior is if we're actually willing to look at perpetrators as human beings who, were born, nobody's born a rapist, right? So they were born into a place in society, and somehow they developed the behavior that led to them being a rapist. But oftentimes when I speak to social workers that specialize in kind of juvenile sex offenses, they'll say, well, nobody goes from like 0 to, committing full-on violent stranger rape right away. There's a series of kind of escalating behaviors that they were probably never held accountable for. So there's something about like that life experience as well, like those kinds of intermediate assaults that take place, which ultimately lead to somebody committing this kind of crime. So I think we need to be willing to look at perpetrators as human beings and understand their whole kind of life experience, if we want to really like look at the truth of this issue and look at the kind of truth of this crime as well.
How do you want readers to respond to Johnny as a character?
I think the way you described in terms of like believe. So on one hand, I want them to believe him as a character. I think my biggest fear was that like, okay, I don't know if people are actually going to buy Johnny as a character. Are they going to buy his voice? Or are they going to buy that like this is a kind of violent 15-year-old boy, even though we all know it's being written by like a 30-something-year-old American woman, right? So like, can they buy this as like as an authentic character? And then, basically, when I was doing drafts of the novel, I kind of had mainly women read it, right? But I specifically wanted Irish women to read it just to see if like the Irishness was believable. But I do want people to respond to him as being a believable character, and on some level, I do want people to feel some kind of empathy or sympathy for him, because he's not, he's not born with a silver spoon in his mouth by any means. Like he's from a place in society that is often stereotyped. He's an Irish traveler, so there's quite a lot of prejudice against him. So I kind of wanted people to get a sense of that outsider status and the kind of attitude you might develop as a result of being seen as, an unwanted member of society, and how that maybe contributes to his personality and to his behavior. So I wanted people to feel some empathy for him. And there were specific things I was doing, and which again I got from, studying Patrick McKay, but in terms of like, how do we, even though this is, a character that most people would never want to actually engage with, like kind of a teenage serial rapist, right? How do we like draw out elements of like humanity for him? So I kind of, I had things like weird jokes that he'll crack and stuff like that, or moments where he looks at the way the moonlight falls on the landscape and appreciates that, or wanting or wishing that his older brother spent more time with him. So these kinds of things that maybe we can relate to as human beings, I want to kind of put in his character just so we could see him as a human being and not as, a creepy monster.
How do you want readers to respond to Vivian?
Vivian's so close to me that it's I'm like, oh, they should love her because she's awesome, right? The one thing I've gotten in terms of like endorsements and people commenting on the book and bloggers is saying that they really kind of feel very much for Vivian. They like very closely identify with her, which is good. Obviously, that's kind of what I want people to feel. And one of the reasons I wrote the book is I do want people to understand, not specifically what it's like to be raped, but in that physical sense, but the whole range of emotions and disruption that happens to your life as a result of that kind of crime. So it's not, people often focus on like what the actual act was about, and like I've actually written in a way which is fairly stream of consciousness, but I think I wanted people to understand like how fundamentally your whole life is affected by that one act, by that one moment of violence. So like all the sense of hopelessness that happens to Vivian that I felt like, in real life as a rape victim, like I wanted to somehow convey that to readers. So yeah, of course I want them to feel sorry for her in some ways, but then I also don't want them to see her as this kind of weak victim. Again, if we look at the media and they talk about rape victims, there's always like some shot of a woman in a corner, like covering her face. And that was me in a lot of ways in the months after my Solon as Vivian as well. But there's also, she is a three-dimensional character. So, you see her before the assault and she's like quite independent. And you kind of see her journey towards trying to reclaim some of that independence after the assault. So I do want them to identify with her. And also, it's important for me to have them both not be like kind of mainstream characters. So I obviously didn't whitewash her. She's still Taiwanese American. So there's elements of how much her identity is affected or not affected by being a person of color. And same thing with Johnny. His Irish traveler identity was quite important, I felt, because I feel like, as human beings, like our things like our gender and our race and our class and our education level all influence our sense of identity, and they all influence the way that we would react to a moment of trauma like this.
Who's your book aimed at? Who do you want reading it?
As many people as possible. Obviously it's interesting because my publishers have this like the sales sheet that they do, and they're like, would be great for trying to get booksellers to be interested in the book. So they say like women, crime readers and activists, right? So which is like a large part of the population. So if women read it, that's great. That's like 51% of the population. I think the people that would tend to read it would be kind of women like that maybe identify as feminists. But like I don't want just feminists reading the book. The whole point is actually if we got more men reading the book. And I'd be curious to see what you think of it as a man having read it. Hopefully that might start to change some understanding about just, the experience of living in a different gender, I suppose, right? And kind of the threats and the insecurities that women sometimes have just going about our everyday lives, right? So in the ideal world, and then also, it's being marketed as crime, I guess because crime is like, it's a lucrative genre and stuff. But on one hand, because there are moments of like, shock and violence in there, I guess crime readers would be more used to encountering that kind of level of intensity. But at the same time, I kind of see it as literary suspense. So I would say anybody that is willing to kind of push the boundaries a bit in terms of the kinds of characters they're willing to explore, and kind of the depths of intensity in terms of life experiences that people are willing to explore. I mean, ideally, they would read that too. So, but as many people as possible.
Would you describe yourself as an activist?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so I do things other than write as well, all around this issue, but I kind of feel like, there's a lot of activist work I do, but I kind of felt for me, as an artist, like, writing is what I do to deal with stuff anyway, and then I felt writing a novel in this way from both perspectives was the most thorough exploration of the issue that I could provide. If I was a musician or I was a painter or whatever, it'd be something else, right? But I'm a writer, so I wanted to write a novel from these two perspectives, and that's kind of hopefully my contribution to this kind of conversation about this issue.
Has community been very important? I noticed for Vivian in the book, has it also been very important for you as
Yeah.
As
Yeah, and there's like different types of community. Obviously, in the book and in my own life, I was lucky enough to have friends that were really supportive. Most of whom hadn't been victims. Some of them were, so there was this whole aspect of like realizing that friends that I had known for years were actually survivors as well, and like that kind of like hidden community. But then, obviously, but most of my friends weren't survivors, so they also equally like didn't know what to do and they were freaking out. So I think community is important in that it supports us, but in the ideal world, like as a society, we'd move forward and our communities would know better how to deal with this issue, and things wouldn't be kind of spoken about, behind closed doors. So, and then obviously community in the other sense, that there is a huge community of survivors out there and activists and therapists working on this issue. So it's about, bringing that community into the open and hopefully creating some kind of positive change in general if you're leveraging or galvanizing that whole community to action, I suppose. I wanted to dramatize what it was like for a rape victim to be going through the trial and having to testify in front of her perpetrator, and just how terrifying that is, and kind of how unfair the whole process is for the victim as well. So I think there's a lot of change that could happen in terms of the criminal justice system.
I felt that your presentation of the police was very positive, though not of the legal system, and that for me felt quite important.
Yeah.
Sort of that the way the police respond is. They take it very seriously.
Yeah.
I feel like that's something people would fear wouldn't happen.
Yeah, and I think it really varies. This is a lot of it's inspired by my own experience, and I actually had a great experience with the police in Northern Ireland. So the police service of Northern Ireland were great in handling the case against my perpetrator. But every case is different, right? So I've heard a lot of complaints about the Metropolitan Police, right, here in London, and I've heard somewhat good things from other people, so I think it really varies, and I don't want this, the case in the novel to be seen as like, the be-all and end-all of how it is for everything. So, the Haven, which is the sexual assault referral center in London, does not come off that well in my novel, right? So, but other people probably have had a good experience with them. So I think the issue is just, fine, the police maybe come off well here, but the issue is just that there isn't any consistency in terms of the quality of service that survivors have. So, like, one individual survivor could be living in a place where the rape crisis center is fantastic and have really good support there, but if somebody's living in a different county, that rape crisis center may not have the same quality of service. So I think the problem is just that the public systems aren't really, they're not consistent in their service, and you can fall through the gaps quite easily a lot of times as well. So actually, in the UK, the paperback's going to come out November 1st, but then it's coming out in hardback in the States in September, and I think in Holland as well in September. I'm not sure exactly about the Holland release, but that's HarperCollins bought it for Holland. And then in Sweden next spring, so Norstedts, who are Stieg Larsson's publishers, they actually bought rights before anybody else, which was quite nice to hear, quite gratifying, right? So they're releasing it, they're publishing it in spring of next year. And then we've just sold German and Czech rights as well, so I think it's coming out in Germany autumn 2018. And it's quite interesting how it's being marketed in the different territories. So it's very much crime here, it's crime in the States as well. I think in Sweden it's probably going to be crime. In Holland, I think it's women's upmarket fiction, potentially. At Germany, it's literary. So I found that whole process interesting in terms of which countries buy it, and you'll notice it's the more kind of So Sweden was the first to buy it, and then Holland last summer. So those are quite gender progressive countries. So they kind of jumped on board right away. And it's still like, I have yet to have any, Southern European countries buy it. So, or anyone outside of Europe or the United States. So, but watching that whole kind of progression has been interesting, especially because I think a lot of publishers were scared of the book just because of the subject matter and like it being so kind of intense and like in your face about trying to address this subject matter, which is a bit weird if you think about how much crime fiction is actually about, like, serial rape and murder, but it's always seen kind of at a distance because, this person's already raped and murdered these women, and then we're just trying to find this person because it's following a detective. And I guess I kind of felt that's a little bit, I guess I kind of felt it was a bit weird that sexual violence on some level was always being used as entertainment in the crime genre, but not actually being looked at in a serious way in terms of how it affects people, right?
Do you feel that if your book is being marketed as crime fiction, there's a risk of people reading it who aren't really engaging with sort of the point you're making, and they are seeing it alongside those kind of texts you're talking about?
I mean, there's always a risk that like people are gonna interpret a text differently from how you want it to be. I mean, hopefully the book is like well written enough that it will engage people in a way that might be different from what they were expecting. I mean, there was one blogger who said that, not sure if it's actually crime because it's more of a gritty drama. Yeah. And then another blogger said, well, if you like dark thrillers, you would like this, right? Because, so I think each individual is going to react to it differently. I mean, there is a chance that maybe somebody's just expecting there to be like a detective, right, who's solving this crime. And I mean, there is a detective in the novel, but he's not the main character, right? So there is a chance of that, and like, I mean, people can close the book and not finish reading it if they want. But I suppose if we can use the crime genre to try to like hook in readers, and if we can then maybe present something different from what they were expecting, but which is still something they get something out of, then that's perfectly fine with me as well.
Do you see it as a subversive text?
I wouldn't go so far as to say subversive, because I'm not like totally subverting a whole crime genre here, right? I mean, I'm using elements of it. And the interesting thing is, when I first started writing the book, obviously I had no intention of it necessarily being like a crime genre novel. So, and it was only like partway through writing it, I would say, it was like almost like 8 months into writing it that I was like, oh, I suppose this could be seen as crime, right? Because, because you do have like the moving back and forth between two perspectives. Like you do have, there's a forensic exam, you do have a court case, you do have like a crime at the center of it. So in some ways it does, most people say it's quite fast paced. So I suppose in that sense it does have the elements of a crime genre novel, but I never intended for that to be the case when I first started writing it, because for me it was just like an exploration of this issue from those two characters. So I wasn't trying to deliberately subvert the genre, but I think I'm using elements of the genre to try to do something a little bit different, but I wouldn't say I'm like subverting it per se. If people want to say that, they can say that too, that's fine.
Thanks again to Winnie M Li. Just to remind you, Dark Chapter is published by Legend Press. We're going to end the episode now with another reading. Thank you very much. I'll see you again soon.
The forensic exam. This is something she'd never thought she'd be part of in her lifetime. These are things you see on television in impressively lit movies set in chilly Scandinavia. These are not events meant for her to experience. Yet here she is in the exam room, bright fluorescent lights and gray-green walls. The examining doctor is a warm maternal woman by the name of Bernadette Phelan, late 50s or early 60s, with soft padded hands and a gentle way of speaking. First, I need you to comb your hair very slowly with this comb. Dr. Phelan presents her with a plain, straight plastic comb, the kind they used to give out in school. She used to comb this very thoroughly through her hair, over a piece of stiff gray paper which will catch any dirt or other bits of potential evidence. She stares at the comb. She hasn't combed her hair with this kind of comb since 3rd grade. Slowly, painfully, she draws the comb through her thick hair, which is matted, tangled with who knows what she picked up while forced down onto the forest floor. The fine comb teeth snag on her hair, rip out a few strands, shaking loose dirt and mud. She does it again and again, showering crumbs of mud onto the paper. Dr. Phelan promptly curls up the paper and tips any evidence into a labeled bag. Next, we need to take swabs from you so we can get samples of any genetic evidence you may have left on your body. They've taken notes on where she said he touched her, so they swab her neck when he started to choke her, her hands and wrists when he pulled her into the woods, her lips, her fingertips, and her mouth. They swab her mouth thoroughly, cotton buds going in and out. And now she can finally have a sip of water. There will be more swabs later. But for now, the photographer will need to take pictures of you. We need this as evidence to document the injuries he sustained. The doctor apologizes to the photographer as male. He was the only one available just now. Will she be okay with that? She nods. She doesn't have much choice. Stand on this piece of paper. There's a white backdrop behind her, blank and clinical. Bright flashbulbs flare into her face, and she's momentarily blind, again and again. A few shots from the front. Now turnarounds, now to the side, and the other sides. Now, very carefully, take off your clothes. Slowly, so we can catch any evidence on that paper beneath your feet. She takes off the long-sleeved blue hiking shirt. It's difficult getting it over her head. There's something like whiplash setting in her neck, her back, stiffening up her body. But she has to do it on her own. No one can help her and risk accidentally getting their genetic material on her while they're collecting evidence. Eventually, she gets the shirt off, drops it on another piece of thick gray paper. She's photographed with her shirt off, showing the torn bra, looking straight ahead, face neutral, tired, wishing she weren't here. It's rare she's ever taken a photograph and not tried to smile. Isn't that what you're supposed to do for photographs? Say cheese? She's been saying cheese since her first kindergarten photograph at the age of 5. But she's definitely not smiling now. She looks straight ahead, eyes dull and blank, staring at the wall and nothing more. Perhaps she should be holding up a sign with a long number in front of her, like a Holocaust victim, like an arrested criminal, awaiting whatever lies ahead. That's quite bleak.